Most people think of veterans being buried in national or battlefield cemeteries, but many opt to be buried in private cemeteries. St. John Cemetery, which was established in 1876, is home to over 250 veterans. Their stories illustrate Pensacola's contributions to its nation. The oldest and first veteran interred here is William W. J. Kelly. Born in 1812, he served as a private in the Second Creek War of 1837, then commanded Company A of the Florida Battalion fighting during the Mexican War, supply officer for the U.S. Navy, and later for the Confederate Navy. Civically, he was one of the founders of the first Masonic chapter in town, Escambia Lodge No. 15, in 1846. He was one of the charter members in establishing this cemetery in 1876. He also served as the first Republican Lieutenant Governor of Florida following the Civil War. He is buried in the special Masonic burial area in the northeast of the cemetery. Over 80 Civil War veterans are interred here. Most had fought for the Confederacy. The majority had moved to Pensacola after the Civil War. However, a few were considered locals who had fought in one of the three companies that had been organized to fight for the Confederacy. The most famous is Edward A. Perry. Although a native of Massachusetts, Perry had moved to Pensacola before the war and worked as an attorney. Following the national election in November 1860, in which Abraham Lincoln won the presidency, he volunteered to defend Pensacola in one of the two companies being organized for that purpose. The newly formed Pensacola Rifle Rangers elected him as their leader. His unit participated in the initial rebel takeover of the Pensacola Naval Yard in 1861 and the subsequent standoff against Fort Pickens. Later, his unit was redesignated Company A of the 2nd Florida Infantry and transferred to the Army of Northern Virginia. Following the Battle of Williamsburg in 1862, he was promoted to command all the Florida regiments assigned in the theater. As colonel and later general, he acted with great professionalism and valor, leading the Florida Battalion in many engagements. After the war, he returned to being an attorney and became the first person from Pensacola to be elected Florida's governor. He is prominently buried and memorialized with a large monument. Two other Confederate generals are buried here: Major General Samuel G. French, who commanded troops in the Western Theater. He had been a graduate of West Point with Ulysses S. Grant and had fought in the Mexican War. He is buried west of Perry. The third Confederate general was a brigadier general like Perry. He is William Miller. He had fought in the Mexican War, became a planter near Pensacola, and rose to command Florida forces in the Western Theater. After having received serious wounds in battle, he was reassigned to command Home Guard forces in Florida. It was there where he led the defense at the Battle of Natural Bridge, which prevented Tallahassee from surrendering to the Federals, the only Confederate capital not captured. Miller is buried southeast of Perry. There are 18 veterans of the Spanish-American War. Many of them had moved to Pensacola a few years before or after the war. The wealthiest was probably Thomas V. Kessler, who also happened to be a distinguished Freemason. He had been a successful manufacturer and businessman from Philadelphia. At 50 years of age, he had moved to Pensacola in 1890 to establish a fertilizer company. During the war, he was made the colonel of the city's Home Guard. His only military background, however, was that he was the grandson of a midshipman who had fought in the American Revolution. Most of the veterans who experienced action during the Spanish-American War were much younger. At 16 years of age, Lucius Boykins was the youngest. He was of African ancestry and had been born in Alabama shortly before his family moved to Pensacola. He enlisted in the U.S. Navy and served as a porter aboard a ship. Lewis D. Robinson served as musician of one of the two volunteer infantry companies from Pensacola. Designated Companies H and I of the 1st Florida Volunteer Infantry, the war was over before the unit saw any action. The troops spent most of their time in camp, eating fat salt meat and grits with coffee too weak to melt the sugar, followed by 2 hours of hard drill daily. Robinson is buried in the older Section 16. About 40 veterans of the First World War are interred here. The most distinguished is probably Charles P. Mason, who rose to the rank of Vice Admiral in the Navy. A native of Pennsylvania and graduate of the Naval Academy, class of 1912, he became Naval Aviator number 52 in Pensacola and fell in love not only with the area, but his future wife. He flew seaplanes during the war, but rose to more prominence as the commanding officer of USS Hornet during the Second World War, earning the Navy Cross. Upon retirement, he returned to Pensacola, becoming its mayor for several years, expanding the size of the city, building the municipal auditorium, and acquiring the gas company from Gulf Power. The park next to Wall South is named in honor of him. He is interred in the newer Section 67. Another notable First World War veteran is Noel Davis. A graduate of the 1914 Naval Academy class, he served as a mine laying officer, supervising the laying of approximately 56,000 mines in the North Sea. When disarming them proved to be more difficult, he developed a way to detonate them with electricity. After the war, he became a naval aviator and married a Pensacola woman. Later, he began writing training manuals for the U.S. Navy and was co-inventor of the first aerial sextant. In 1927, he attempted the first non-stop flight from the United States to France, but his plane crashed immediately after takeoff. Charles Lindbergh accomplished this attempt a month later. The Navy continues to memorialize Davis, awarding the Most Outstanding Squadron Award in his honor annually. Davis was buried in his wife's family plot in Section 5. Pensacola native Lloyd Gerald was drafted in the Army in early April 1918. He was mustered into a colored segregated unit whose men were issued blue French Adrian helmets and were primarily under French control. His unit saw action during the Second Battle of the Marne, in which the Allies defeated the last German offensive in the war. Gerald's is buried in the original colored-only section. At 150, there are more Second World War veterans than any other war. The most distinguished is John C. Waldron, who rose to the rank of lieutenant commander in the Navy. A native of South Dakota and graduate of the Naval Academy class of 1924, he became a naval aviator in Pensacola, where he met his future wife. He gained fame at the Battle of Midway while leading his torpedo bomber squadron into a doomed attack, thus diverting attention towards his squadron and away from the main dive bomber attack that ultimately crippled the Japanese aircraft carriers. He was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross. A Sumner-class destroyer, a Naval Auxiliary Air Station Field in Texas, training station in Idaho, and bridge in South Dakota subsequently were named in his honor. His monument rests next to his wife's remains. The Verrazzo brothers provide another example of the sacrifices experienced in the Second World War. Charlie Verrazzo was the youngest of 5 brothers. Each of his brothers had entered the military. John, the oldest, had joined the Army. Sava and Nick had both joined the Navy, and Gus had joined the Army Air Corps. All 4 advised Charlie not to enlist with their respective branches, citing specific reasons. Wanting to do his duty, Charlie felt that the only branch not mentioned was the Marine Corps, so he joined the Marines. His journey took him throughout the South Pacific and into tough jungle fighting. He said, quote, "As I saw my friends get killed, I said to myself, I can't believe I volunteered for this. I did a lot of crying after the battles." End quote. While her sons were off fighting, their mother, Mahi, who was a native of Greece, was trying to gain her U.S. citizenship. Prior to appearing before the judge, she had been advised that the answers to most questions were FDR, as he was the president. However, when the judge asked her the name of the first president, and she answered FDR, Mahi's attorney intervened, reminding the judge that Mrs. Verrazzo didn't speak good English, but all 5 of her sons were fighting in the armed forces. The judge immediately granted Mahi U.S. citizenship. All but one of the Verrazzo sons returned home to her. Sava, who was in the Navy, did not. All of the Verrazzos are buried in St. John's. Over 20 veterans fought in the Korean War. One, Jeremy Hargreaves, was drafted in the British Army and later married a Pensacola woman. He is buried in his wife's family plot. Another, named Walter Payne, followed in his father's footsteps and became a doctor in the military. While his father had served in the First World War, he served during Korea. The smallest number of veterans fought in the Vietnam War. However, many in this group of men are just now entering their maximum life expectancy years. Undoubtedly, their numbers will increase. Some in this conflict experienced contact with Agent Orange, which was a defoliant used during the conflict. Roy Isaacson, Sr., is one such veteran. He served in Vietnam and made a career in the Air Force. His exposure to Agent Orange caused cancer, specifically multiple myeloma, which killed him. If you would like more information about the veterans who are interred in St. John's, visit the cemetery's website and click on the Heritage tab followed by the Military button. There you will find a list of all the veterans interred. While some of the veterans fought in 2 or more conflicts, the database only allows for 1 war to be listed. If you would like to submit information or a photo of a veteran, please email your request to info@stjohnsdb.com to coordinate this exchange.